our materials. We're going to start with just a very gestural pose. I'm not going to be too worried about things like, the details of the hands or anything like that. We're just going to get acquainted with the medium here. So I'm just moving down the torso as my reference. We've got one leg coming forward. And a back leg. Right, and now let's move up to the neck and the outer angle of her face. And our chin, I'm just going to do a line to describe the eyes, the bottom of the nose, bottom of the lips. Now coming in with the neck and the other arm. And let's get the breasts. Whoops. A few more details on the face. We can carve out the eyes. A little bit of the nose, the upper lip. Okay, and now let's get started. So I'm going to use Ecoline 374 as the main color. And then you can either use a sepia. I left my sepia in the studio, so I'm going to use Ecoline 440, but this sepia, another brown would work, or indigo. And I'm going to suggest that for this, we just start with this and just build in color. So just 2 colors, let's begin with. So I'm just going to wet down the paper. And here we're going to create a contrast between the wet on wet technique with our liquid watercolor. And then if you want, we'll come back in with some stronger lines. So you could use a pen. I'm going to use a charcoal pencil. You could use a watercolor pencil. But basically we're going to contrast really fluid blooms of paint with sharper contour. So I'm just going to pour some of this out. And the reference I have, we've got some light just coming down this side of the figure. It's a really simple composition in regards to light. So let's get started. I'm going to move down the torso. So see how that paint is just blending out. And if you want a little bit more control, so if you don't like this effect where it's kind of like, branching off into rivets, you could just dry your paper a little bit, and wetting it down will just make the paint a bit easier to move. I like this kind of contrast between the chaos of the medium and more refined lines, so I'm not too worried about maintaining control here, but you can get varying degrees of control. So basically, the drier your paper, the more controlled your marks are going to be. And through this class, we are going to be just combining controlled marks with more fluid liquid marks to create watercolor nudes. And the good thing here is that, like, if you're using a medium, you want to have a reason to use it. So I do think that in many ways, if for controlled paintings, if you wanted to do sort of a controlled nude, oils are actually a better bet because you can get the colors just the same value that they are in your reference. Here with watercolors, we're kind of in our minds making them a bit lighter, so we're like kind of editing our reference in our mind to bring all the values up because watercolors are so light. But the thing about watercolors, when it comes to the subject of the nude to work with, that they have going for them is this liquid quality. And skin, like obviously the figure, is mainly made up of water. And when we get that kind of watery effect showing through, it can create a really nice dynamic, just engaging effect on the overall composition. So that's where I like sort of when you can see a little bit of indication about the medium that you're using, how the medium spreads out, and working wet on wet really does exemplify that in watercolors. That loss of control is what's so characteristic about water mediums, and the challenge is just combining that loss of control with enough control that if you're trying to depict a figurative subject, you can actually, translate what you're putting down into reality. And now, while the paint is still wet, I'm going to add in some indigo. You could use a brown color. I'm just going to use indigo. It's entirely up to you. We're just separating cool and warm tones. So brown will create kind of more of a realistic effect. This will create more of a painterly effect, adding in just blue. So let's go. I'm just going to move down this arm. And I'm going to use this exercise as a chance just to play around and explore with the medium. So we've got the basic form of the figure, but as you're moving down, instead of just trying to create realism, you also want to be playing around with understanding how your medium is interacting with the page, with the amount of liquid that you have down, with the other colors, as it dries. So just sort of taking your time to experiment with the supplies that you're using before we move on to a more controlled painting. So depending on what paper you're using, you might have a very different effect from this, which is great. The variety is what makes this interesting. So just kind of pay close attention to how these colors are bleeding into one another, whether you like the effect that they're making, whether you don't. Another key thing about skin tone is that it's very dependent on environment. So the way we perceive skin tone is really dependent on what color the background is. So just to illustrate this point, I'm going to put in just a little bit of the background, and this is going to make the highlights come through a bit more and just help with creating more of an integrated understanding of the skin tone. It's interesting as you put down the darker colors, just kind of getting a sense of how the tone of the background changes the focus that the eye has on the figure. So the more of this darker background I put on this side where the shadow is, the more the focus moves towards this part of the figure. Just going to get a bit more ink. And you can do the whole page if you want to kind of create a finished painting out of this. I'm just going next to the skin tones just to, throw the color of the skin into relief, and just to make things quick. All right, so I'm going to move a bit more tan here, and then I'm going to wait for this to dry a little bit, or simply get out a hairdryer and dry my paint a bit. Because once it's dry, the next layer of paint that I put down is going to appear darker and crisper. Okay, so now I've dried it with the hairdryer. I'm just bringing this in because I'm trying to get the color on my camera to work, but just so you can see the effect. I really like this kind of chaotic effect coming through here. And one nice way of kind of bringing this together is to use a really sharp outline. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to make this into sort of a line and wash work. I'm going to use a charcoal pencil and simply outline the figure. So it's a combination of drawing and painting. This is sometimes referred to as line and wash if you're interested in this technique. So having kind of, I mean, literally what it says, lines and then washes of color. Just fiddle around with that. Okay, that's a bit clearer. Okay, and now I'm just going to move in again. Let me get my paint, my paintbrush, with some more of that Ecoline beige color. And you'll note that when you're using the color on dry paint, the edges are a lot crisper. Put in the belly button. I'm gonna make this leg a little bit darker. So put in a bit more detail around the face. Okay, so this is a technique you might want to come back to. So note when I kind of surround an area of shadow with a darker edge, it creates more of a luminous effect. And that's something that you can really amp up with liquid watercolors. You can get a ton of luminosity. And the darker you make the background, the more the detail within the figure is going to really pop out. So I won't do the full figure, but I'll just show you. If I just come back in and create a much darker background, it'll influence the amount of detail that we can see within the figure. Okay, so I won't finish the full figure just because I don't want to have to put in all this background, but you can see just if you want to put the full background in, so darker indigo color, it'll really make all of the information within the figure pop. Okay, so I'll leave that here so we can move on to another exercise.